On a September morning in 1974, a small blue Volkswagen Beetle rolled out through the gates of a palace in Addis Ababa. Inside the back seat sat a tiny, frail old man in a plain dark suit. He was 82 years old. He said almost nothing. And the soldiers driving him away treated him like an ordinary prisoner because that is exactly what he had just become. But this was no ordinary man. This was Haile Selassie I, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, King of Kings, elect of God, the 225th ruler, at least by his family's own count, of a royal line that claimed to stretch back 3,000 years, all the way to King Solomon of ancient Israel and the Queen of Sheba. He had been crowned in a cathedral dripping with gold. Kings and presidents had bowed to him. On the other side of the world, in the hills of Jamaica, hundreds of thousands of people literally worshipped him as a living god. And now he was being carried off in the cheapest car the army could find, so that the sight of it would humiliate him, so that everyone watching would understand that the age of emperors was over. Within a year, he would be dead. His body would be hidden, and the search for it would take nearly 2 decades. His children and grandchildren would be locked in prison cells, some of them for 16 years. A few would never come out alive. The palaces would become government offices, the crown would become a museum piece, and a dynasty that had survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottomans, and even an Italian invasion would finally be brought down not by a foreign army, but by a committee of young soldiers with Marxist textbooks and a grudge. So here's the question I want to answer today. What actually happened to the people? Not just the emperor, but the whole imperial family. The princes and the princesses, the grandchildren, the heirs. Where did they go? Who survived? And what is left of the oldest ruling house on earth now, more than 50 years after it was thrown off its throne? Because the real story, the human story, is far stranger and far sadder than the history books usually let on. Let's get into it. To understand how far this family fell, you first have to understand how high they had climbed and how long they had been up there. Most royal families measure their history in centuries. The Ethiopian imperial house measured it in millennia. According to their own sacred national epic, a medieval book called the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings, the story begins around 3,000 years ago, when the Queen of Sheba traveled from her kingdom in the Horn of Africa to Jerusalem to meet the legendary King Solomon. She was drawn by his wisdom. She left, carrying his child. That child was Menelik, and when he grew up, he journeyed back to his father and returned home carrying, so the legend says, the Ark of the Covenant itself. From Menelik, the story goes, descended an unbroken chain of Ethiopian monarchs, all the way down to the little man in the blue Volkswagen. Now, historians will tell you the truth is messier than the legend. The line was not really unbroken. The version of the dynasty we are talking about was actually refounded in the year 1270, when a ruler named Yakuno Amlak seized the throne and declared himself the rightful Solomonic heir, restoring the sacred bloodline. But whether you take the legend literally or not, one thing is undeniable. This was one of the longest continuous monarchies in all of human history. When European kings were still living in wooden halls, Ethiopia had emperors, cathedrals, written laws, and its own ancient branch of Christianity. The emperors carried titles that sound almost mythical: King of Kings, Elect of God, the Lion of Judah. And the lion was not just a symbol. Emperor Haile Selassie kept actual lions at his palace. Into this world, in 1892, a boy named Tafari Makonnen was born. He was not a direct heir. He was the son of a powerful governor, a cousin of the ruling family. But he was clever, patient, and ruthless when he needed to be, and he climbed. By 1916, he had become regent, the real power behind the throne. And in 1930, after the death of the reigning empress, he was crowned in his own right, taking the name Haile Selassie, which means the power of the Trinity. His coronation was a spectacle the world had never seen from Africa. Foreign royalty and diplomats poured into Addis Ababa. And it was this very coronation that thousands of miles away in Jamaica lit a fire that still burns today. A generation of black Jamaicans, inspired by preachers who had told them to look to Africa for the crowning of a king, saw the crowning of this African emperor as the fulfillment of prophecy. They took his old princely name, Rastafari, and built an entire faith around him, the Rastafari. To them, this man was not just a king, he was the returned Messiah, God in human form. Hold on to that, because it becomes one of the most haunting ironies of the whole story. Haile Selassie was a genuine modernizer. He gave Ethiopia its first written constitution. He built schools and hospitals and roads. When fascist Italy invaded in 1935, he stood before the League of Nations in Geneva and delivered a speech warning that if the world let a dictator swallow his small country, the same fate would eventually come for everyone. The world ignored him. Italy occupied Ethiopia, and the emperor spent 5 bitter years in exile in England before returning in triumph in 1941. After the war, he became a towering figure on the world stage. He helped found the Organization of African Unity and chose Addis Ababa as its home, making his capital the political heart of a newly independent Africa. From the outside in the 1960s, he looked untouchable. A god king, a modern statesman, a living legend. But inside Ethiopia, the ground was already shifting beneath his feet. The first tremor came in 1960. While the emperor was away on a state visit to Brazil, a faction of his own imperial guard staged a coup and tried to seize the government. It failed. Loyal troops crushed it. But something had cracked. The idea that the emperor was sacred and untouchable had been openly challenged, and everybody had seen it. Worse, the ringleaders had not been peasants or foreigners. They were educated men from inside his own system, and their complaint was simple. The country was not changing fast enough. Ethiopia was still, in many ways, a feudal kingdom, where a small aristocracy owned nearly everything and millions of farmers owned nothing. Through the 1960s, that anger grew. University students marched through the streets with a slogan that cut right to the heart of the problem. Land to the tiller, give the land to the people who actually work it. The emperor, now an old man, made small gestures, but never truly let go of the old order. And an aging autocrat who will not bend is an aging autocrat waiting to break. Then came the famine. In 1973, a devastating drought struck the northern provinces. Tens of thousands of people starved to death, by some estimates well over 100,000, and the government did almost nothing. Worse, it tried to hide it. But this was the television age. A foreign documentary crew got footage of the dying and cut it together with footage of the imperial court, of lavish banquets, of the emperor feeding scraps of meat to his pet dogs from a silver tray, while children wasted away in the countryside. When that contrast reached the public, it was devastating. The mystique shattered. The God King suddenly looked like a rich old man presiding over a starving nation. By early 1974, the whole system was coming apart. Soldiers, furious over low pay and bad conditions, began to mutiny. Taxi drivers struck over fuel prices. Teachers struck over reforms. Muslims marched demanding equal rights. Every group with a grievance took to the streets at once, and there was no strong hand left to stop them. And then, out of the chaos, a shadowy new force emerged, a committee of junior military officers drawn from units all across the country. They called themselves, in the local language, the Derg. It simply means the committee. At first, nobody even knew who its members were. They had no famous leader, no manifesto, no throne, but they were disciplined, and they were patient, and they understood something the aristocracy did not. Power was lying in the street, and all you had to do was walk over and pick it up. What the Derg carried out over 1974 is sometimes called a creeping coup. They did not storm the palace on day one. Instead, month by month, they arrested the emperor's ministers, generals, and advisors one at a time, always claiming they were just investigating corruption, always with the emperor's reluctant signature on the paperwork. They peeled away his protection layer by layer, like stripping a man of his clothes in the cold. By September, the old emperor was alone. Every powerful person around him was already behind bars. On the 11th of September, 1974, they came for the family, the princes and princesses, the grandchildren, the in-laws. They were rounded up and taken to prison. And the very next morning, the 12th of September, the soldiers came for the emperor himself. They read out a proclamation deposing him. He is said to have listened quietly and then remarked that if this was what the revolution wanted for the good of the people, then he would not stand in its way. And then they walked him out to that little blue Volkswagen and drove him away, from a palace where his family had reigned for centuries, to a bare army bungalow where he would live out his final months as a captive. Let that sink in for a moment. 3,000 years of claimed dynasty ended in a single car ride. But if you think the deposition was the tragedy, you have not heard the worst of it yet. Because what came next was blood. On the 23rd of November, 1974, barely 2 months after the emperor was removed, the Derg gathered around 60 of the most senior figures of the old regime, men they had arrested during the creeping coup, and executed them. No trial, no verdict, just a firing squad in the dark and an announcement on the radio the next day. Among the dead were 2 former prime ministers, generals, aristocrats, the entire leadership class of imperial Ethiopia, wiped out in a single night. Even the Derg's own first chairman, a respected general named Aman Andam, was killed that same day, after he clashed with the hardliners who wanted more blood. And among those 60 men, there was the emperor's own grandson, a naval officer, Rear Admiral Iskender Desta. He was shot alongside the others. His grandfather, the deposed emperor, was still alive at the time, a prisoner just a few miles away. Imagine being an 82-year-old man stripped of everything and learning that they have just executed your grandson. Ethiopians remember that day as Bloody Saturday. It was the moment the revolution announced that it would show no mercy, not even to a boy from the royal house. In March of 1975, the Derg made it official. They abolished the monarchy entirely. No more emperor, no more crown, ever again. Ethiopia was declared a socialist state. All the land, all the great estates, all the property of the aristocracy was seized by the government. The old world was not just defeated, it was erased. And then, on the 27th of August, 1975, the last emperor of Ethiopia died. The official announcement was almost insultingly brief. It said he had died of complications following a medical procedure. Almost nobody believed it. His son, the crown prince, who was safe abroad, immediately said his father had been in excellent health and demanded that independent doctors and the Red Cross be allowed to examine the body. The request was refused. There would be no autopsy. There would be no funeral the family could attend. And for years, nobody even knew where the body was. The truth, most historians now accept, is that Haile Selassie was murdered. The most widely believed account is that he was smothered or strangled in his bed on the orders of the man who would soon rule Ethiopia with an iron fist, Mengistu Haile Mariam. And then, in a final act of contempt, they hid him. They buried the King of Kings in secret, in an unmarked spot on the palace grounds. Some accounts say his remains were concealed beneath a concrete slab. Others, more chilling still, say they were buried under a latrine, under a toilet, so that for years the new rulers of Ethiopia would walk over the bones of the emperor they had destroyed. Whether that detail is literally true or a story the nation told itself, the meaning is the same. They wanted him gone, forgotten, and disrespected, even in death. Now let's turn to the ones who were still alive. Because while the emperor's fate was sealed quickly, his family entered a nightmare that would last for the better part of 2 decades. Remember, most of the imperial family had been arrested back in September of 1974. The men and the women were separated. The women, the princesses, and the granddaughters were held together in a special section of a prison in Addis Ababa. And here's a detail that tells you everything about how the new regime saw them. The emperor's eldest daughter, Princess Tenashniwerk, a dignified woman in her 60s who had been the most senior lady of the imperial court, was officially registered as prisoner number 1. The number 1 prisoner in all of Ethiopia was not a general or a politician. It was an old princess. That was the statement they wanted to make. These women were not held for a year or 2 or 5. They were held for 14 years. 14 years of imprisonment. Most of it without charge, without trial, without any crime other than the blood in their veins. Granddaughters who had grown up in palaces spent their entire youth behind bars. Some of them had been young women when they went in, and were middle-aged when they came out. And not all of them came out. Early in 1976, one of the emperor's granddaughters, Princess Ijigayehu, fell ill in prison. She was denied proper medical care, and she died in her cell. She was 39 years old. The grief in that prison must have been unbearable. These women had already lost their emperor, their homes, their brothers and sons to the firing squads, and now they were losing each other to sickness and neglect one by one with no idea when or if it would ever end. The men of the family had it even harder. The male relatives of the emperor were held for even longer than the women, in many cases for around 16 years. 16 years. To put that in human terms, a man could be arrested with a young child and walk free when that child was fully grown. The women were finally released in 1988. The surviving men followed around 1989 and 1990, as the regime that had imprisoned them began, at last, to collapse. Now, not everyone had been caught in the net in 1974, and this is where the story splits in two. The crown prince, Asfa Wasan, the emperor's eldest son and rightful heir, had actually been abroad receiving medical treatment when the revolution swept in. He had suffered a stroke and was recovering in Europe. That accident of timing saved his life. He was never imprisoned. Instead, he became the leader of the imperial family in exile, first in London and later in the United States, where a large part of the family eventually settled, mostly around Washington, D.C. and the suburbs of Virginia. For years, he lived the strange half-life of a king without a country. And then, in 1989, with his father long dead and the monarchy long abolished, the exiled family did something quietly defiant. They formally declared him emperor, Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia. It was a throne that existed only on paper, a crown made of memory. He would never rule a single square inch of Ethiopian soil. But the family was making a point. You can abolish our titles in Ethiopia, but you cannot make us stop being who we are. Haile Selassie, the emperor who never got to be emperor, died in Virginia in 1997. Meanwhile, back in Ethiopia, the regime that had destroyed the monarchy was rotting from within. Mengistu's government had unleashed years of terror, executing not just royalists, but its own rivals, students, and dissidents in a campaign so brutal it became known as the Red Terror. It fought endless wars. It presided over another catastrophic famine in the 1980s, the one the whole world saw on television. And by 1991, it was finished. Rebel armies closed in on the capital, and Mengistu, the man who had ordered the emperor's death, fled the country. He escaped to Zimbabwe, where, astonishingly, he still lives to this day, an old man sheltered from justice, sentenced in his absence by an Ethiopian court, but never handed over. And with the fall of that regime came one last, strange chapter for the emperor himself. In 1992, workers digging on the old palace grounds finally found what had been hidden for 17 years, a set of bones, buried in secret near the office of the very man who had ordered his death. They had found the emperor. The King of Kings had been lying beneath his conqueror's feet the entire time. For 8 more years, those remains waited. And then, in November of the year 2000, 25 years after his death, Haile Selassie was finally given a burial. It was an extraordinary day and a bittersweet one. His coffin, draped in the old imperial flag with its Lion of Judah, was carried in a grand procession through Addis Ababa. It stopped at the cathedral where he had been crowned emperor 70 years earlier, and it ended at Holy Trinity Cathedral, the great church he himself had built, where he was laid to rest beside his empress in a towering granite tomb. But here's the thing that reveals how complicated his legacy still was. The Ethiopian government of the day refused to grant it the status of a state funeral. Officially, the nation would not mourn him as a hero. To some Ethiopians, he was a beloved father figure, a symbol of independence and pride. To others, he was the out-of-touch emperor who let his people starve. Both of those things could be true at once, and the country never fully resolved them. And then there was the strangest guest list of all. Remember the Rastafari, the faith that had crowned him a living god half a century earlier? Bob Marley's widow, Rita Marley, came to pay her respects and spoke of the emperor's eternal reign. But many Rastafari around the world boycotted the funeral entirely. Why? Because to a true believer, a god cannot die. Many of them refused to accept that the bones in that coffin were his, or that he had ever really died at all. So you had this astonishing scene. A man overthrown, murdered, and disrespected in his own homeland, being mourned as a fallen deity by worshippers from across the ocean who would not even admit he was gone, deposed as a king in Ethiopia, immortal as a god in Jamaica. Few human beings in history have ever lived or died inside a contradiction that sharp. So what about now? What is left of Ethiopia's royal family today in our own time? The answer is they are still here. Scattered, quieter, stripped of all political power, but very much alive. The head of the imperial house of Ethiopia today is Zira Jacob Haile Selassie, a grandson of the last emperor, born in 1953. He was actually designated as heir by his grandfather in the final desperate months before the fall, and he leads the family in the eyes of its supporters, though of course he rules nothing. The most publicly active member of the family is probably another grandson, Prince Ermias Haile Selassie, who has spent decades as president of the Crown Council of Ethiopia, the body that keeps the imperial legacy alive. He lives in the United States, and he represents something rather beautiful about what the family has become. He is of mixed heritage, Amhara, Oromo, and Gurajel, drawing together several of the peoples of Ethiopia in one bloodline. In recent years, he founded a charitable trust aimed not at reclaiming a throne, but at education, entrepreneurship, and cultural preservation for ordinary Ethiopians. As Ethiopia has been torn by ethnic conflict in the modern era, he has spoken again and again about unity, about being Ethiopians first, presenting the old crown not as a claim to power, but as a symbol that once held a fractured nation together. Because let's be clear about the political reality. There is no serious movement to put an emperor back on a throne. Ethiopia today is a federal republic, and it has moved on. The family knows this. They are not plotting a restoration. They are something else now. They have become the keepers of a memory, the custodians of a 3,000-year story, making sure it is not forgotten in a country that once tried very hard to erase it. Their palaces are museums that tourists walk through. Their ancestors' tomb is a place of pilgrimage, and their name still carries a weight that no elected officials ever quite will. So what do we take from all of this? What is the real lesson buried inside this incredible story? I think it is this. You can destroy a throne in an afternoon. You can execute the ministers, imprison the family, hide the emperor's body under a stone, and abolish a crown with the stroke of a pen. The Derg did all of that, and they did it thoroughly. And yet, half a century later, the men who did the destroying are dead, disgraced, or hiding in foreign exile. And the family they tried to erase is still standing, not in power, but in memory, still bearing the name, still telling the story, still, in their own way, refusing to disappear. The emperor himself once warned the world from that podium in Geneva that indifference to the suffering of others always comes back around. He was talking about nations and dictators, but there is a smaller, more personal truth hiding in his own family's fate. Power built on fear does not last. The Derg ruled through terror and lasted 17 years. The dynasty they overthrew, for all its faults, had lasted, by its own reckoning, for 3,000. And the part of it that outlived the guns was never the gold, or the palaces, or the titles. It was the story people chose to keep telling. It turns out that thrones are surprisingly easy to topple. It is the memory that is almost impossible to kill. The Ethiopian royal family lost their empire, their emperor, their freedom, their homeland, and in some cases their lives. But they did not lose their story. And more than 50 years after a little blue car carried the last king of kings out through the palace gates, that story is still being told. Right here, right now, by us. If this story moved you, do me a favor and drop a lion emoji in the comments so I know you made it to the end. If you learned something new today, hit that subscribe button because it genuinely helps this channel keep bringing these forgotten histories back to life. Let me know in the comments what you think. Should the world remember Haile Selassie as a hero or as a flawed old emperor who lost his way? I'll see you in the next one.